Hi, and welcome to another Extreme Networks Technology webcast. The subject matter of this session is going to be best practices for securing OT, ICS, and IoT environments. I'm Ed Kohler, and I'll be your host. Our agenda is relatively straightforward, and we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's move forward with the introduction. The purpose of this session is to define and outline and update best security practices for IoT, ICS, and OT environments. We're going to begin by providing definitions to these technologies because they are different. We're going to then look at the similarities and differences between these technology areas and how they will lead to different considerations for security, practice, and implementation. We're also going to look at new developments in machine learning and artificial intelligence and how that is impacting this arena as well. And then we'll conclude with a summary and a series of references for further research. Now, what is the difference between IoT, OT, and ICS? Many times we've used these terms interchangeably, usually under the banner of IoT, Internet of Things. But that really needs to start to change because, first of all, many IoT systems are personal, many OT and ICS systems are critical. So there's a vast differentiation there. So we're going to step forward and we're going to ask a number of questions. Now, it might seem to be a daunting task to say, how do I classify this broad range of devices? But actually, it's pretty straightforward. We ask two questions. Question number one, is the device in question managed by a system other than the device itself? If the answer is no, then the device is probably IoT. And examples of that would be a smartwatch, a simple surveillance camera, a Roku or Apple TV, any personal assistant device, your BYOD, your smartphone, your tablets, anything like that would fit into that category. If the answer is yes, there is a management system involved, then we need to ask, is the device involved in some sort of synchronized process or workflow? If the answer to that question is yes, then we would classify the device as an industrial control system component. Examples of that would be manufacturing process drives, but also things like warehouse automation and also certain aspects of power grid management as well. If the answer is no, then the device falls into a rather broad area of operational technologies. And there we have physical security systems, video surveillance systems, building management systems, and also certain aspects of power grid management as well. Now, these two questions are only a high-level guide, but it does serve as a useful first step litmus test. The main point here is operational technology and industrial control cannot operate without supporting back-end systems. So this leads to important considerations in the overall security posture and corresponding practice. Now, those two questions lead to a spectrum, a scale, if you will. And we can see that on the lower axis, I have the degree of system control, the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis, the degree of human interaction. The result of that and the answer to those two questions kind of results in a number of clusters. You can see that up in the upper right-hand portion of the screen, we have IoT, clear and pure. BYOD, personal IoT, standalone cameras, things of that nature, all fitting up in that area where there is no management system and the degree of human interaction is very, very high. We move over to the left-hand portion of the screen, and in the lower left corner, we see that we have process flow orientation, manufacturing process flow, warehouse automation, power grid management, where the degree of system control is very high and the degree of human interaction is typically very low. And then in the middle, we have a vast array of operational technologies, anything from sensors to building management systems and anything in between. So really asking those two questions and then fitting the device in question within this matrix will help you and guide you as far as the security best practices and the associated policies that you need to establish for that device in question. Now, why does this matter? Well, first of all, IoT devices can be anything from anywhere, from anyone, for any purpose. They're a bit like wild horses. IoT devices are also typically personal in nature and accessed directly by the user. IoT devices often have requirements or capabilities for external communication, whether intended or otherwise. As a matter of fact, many IoT devices will not work without that external communication capability. Most IoT devices also tend to be wireless in nature. Not all of them, but most of them, particularly in modern times. OT and ICS devices, by contrast, are seldom accessed directly by humans. The only time is usually in maintenance or troubleshooting. OT and ICS devices are typically strictly controlled by a management system as well, although OT devices may have a relatively high range of autonomous behavior when compared to ICS devices. These main differences in behavior will lead to profound differences in proper security handling and practice. That is the whole point for looking at this under a magnifying glass. So, with that, let's address our final question before we move forward. What role is machine learning and artificial intelligence playing in these new technology areas? Well, both IoT as well as OT and ICS will strongly benefit from machine learning and artificial intelligence, but for different reasons. In the IoT arena, personal IoT will be better capable of seeing patterns, particularly patterns and trends for healthcare. Home IoT environments will become smarter and lead to more efficiency, security, and comfort. OT technologies correspondingly will give increased capabilities in pattern or object recognition for video surveillance, perhaps chemical recognition via sensors in the work environment, improved facility efficiency from a building perspective. Industrial control system devices will become increasingly more efficient in action and workflow with the ability to learn and optimize within the workflow environment. All areas will see devices with increased autonomy and local learning and decision capability with the eventual push towards autonomous robotics. This trend will add to new dimensions and security considerations. So we need to take note of it, but I'm not going to cover it here. It's too much to bite. And look for a separate webcast where I'm going to talk about best practices for securing machine learning and artificial intelligence environments. Just take note here that it needs to be considered and will increasingly become important moving forward in the future. Now, when someone brings you an IoT device and says, hey, I want to put this on the network, well, there's a number of questions you should be asking. First of all, should the device be on the network? And if so, why? Again, I want to note that most IoT devices are personal in nature and really only need to communicate within a PAN, personal area network, and perhaps externally. So think about a smartwatch talking with the smartphone and perhaps talking to Google. That type of scenario. What is the intended purpose of the device? The user must be bringing it in for a purpose. If the device needs to be on the network, why? And can it be accommodated as a guest? Perhaps we create an employee guest network where perhaps that's a BYOD network where people can bring in their smartphones and their PAN devices and they are held at arm's length. They can get to enterprise resources utilizing something like our Zero Trust Universal Network Access. That would provide the ability for an application level portal so that we can keep the smartphone at a distance. The user can still get access to enterprise resources, but is not directly touching the enterprise network with their device, their IoT device. The other question to ask is, what are the device's capabilities beyond its intended purposes? Think about rogue behavior. What would happen if that device were compromised? Also think about malware propagation vectors as well, things like botnets and that nature. What are the device's communication requirements? I often said, or I have already said, that often there are external requirements. Are there internal requirements? And if so, with what and why? And if the device needs to communicate internally and externally, that's a red flag. That requires a security exception in my mind, and you should be asking a lot of questions about that device. And it should start to be treated more on the area of operational technology. And we'll talk about that moving forward. The last thing you want to consider is what is the country of origin? As a matter of fact, this may be the first thing you want to consider. Is the IoT device from a country of known risk? And I give a website for export controls and high risk country guidance. Even if the device is from a low risk country, check out the device supply chain, check out the integrity of the vendor, check out the hardware and software cadence. And I do talk about this in a separate bullet. So without further ado, let's move forward. But really, you need to have these questions asked and answered prior to putting an IoT device. And in most instances, I would say an IoT device needs to be in some sort of modified guest network, not in the actual enterprise user domain. Now, from there, we move on to OT and ICS technologies. And the common reference model that we use here is the Purdue reference model. It's been around for quite some time, referenced by ANSI and IEC standards, in prep for Industry 4.0 in IT, OT convergence, and the ability for cyber physical systems on the production floor. As you can see, the model lays out a series of levels, level 0 at the drive level, the equipment level on the production floor itself, sensors and actuators, all the way up to business intelligence and business systems at level 5. Now, typically, these have been separated by a security demarcation of firewall. And that has been a rather hard firewall that has separated the IT from the OT environment. Now, just-in-time manufacturing has changed the paradigm a bit so that we need to get more information off of the production floor in order to deal with a just-in-time runtime environment. That shows that we need to have increased business intelligence on the runtime factory floor. That can feed into analytics for pipeline intelligence and compare us with our opportunity pipeline. We need data warehousing so that we can store the information, and all of that funneling up to business intelligence for upper level management to make ongoing decisions for the organization. In order to accomplish this goal, we need further information from the production floor, which is giving the increased prevalence for IoT type technologies, sensors, smart intelligent factories, tools, things of that nature on the production floor environment. And at that point, we, of course, would classify it into OT technologies, not necessarily IoT personal devices. Now, this is all laudable and somewhat required for a just-in-time manufacturing environment. However, it's opened up security loopholes. It has increased the attack surface, and we've seen a number of organizations getting bit from this. So we need to add and realize that we have to provide comprehensive practice in the OT and ICS environment, and we have to really provide a gated access into the IT environment. I'm going to talk about how that is accomplished. So with that, we come to the best practices for securing OT and ICS. And I'm going to step through each of these. We're not going to enumerate them here on this slide. So the first one we want to consider is risk assessment and asset inventory. We want to create a comprehensive asset inventory of your OT ICS environment. And this should be done separate from a normal IT inventory and assessment because your skills requirements are going to be different, your knowledge levels are going to be different, and perhaps the degree of specialization is going to be different as well. As a matter of fact, it will be different. In OT and ICS environments, we want to handle the asset inventory within the context of a system or the system in question. Examples are the video surveillance system, the entry and exit system for the building. These would be examples of operational technologies. In industrial control systems, we want to be specific. We want to say production floor A, flow 1, flow 2, flow 3, etc. If there's multiple flows on production floor A. We want to be very specific here. And one of the reasons why we want to do that is, first of all, accuracy of the inventory, but also it allows us to go to a second step where we start to have an understanding of the network communication within the system itself. That gives us an idea to a normalized system communication profile. A very important step in risk assessment, but it's also an important step in establishing a baseline for anomaly detection as we move forward. And we'll cover that moving forward as well. Perform risk assessments not only at the device and OS level, but at the system level as well, and also consider software and applications as assets in your inventory as well, and have a risk rating associated with those too. Implement a risk rating process. Critical vulnerability scoring is one, but you may want to develop your own that's specific to your environment, and you may want to develop your own prioritization specific to your environment as well. Develop a process to record and address discovered vulnerabilities, both at the device OS and also at the network communications level. And then utilize automation in the ongoing process. The first time you do this, there's going to be a heavy lift associated. But once you have an ongoing process, you can utilize network access control, universal zero trust network access from Extreme, and also vulnerability scanners such as Open Vulnerability Scanner. There's many others in the industry, and all of this can optimize your ongoing processes so this becomes much easier on an ongoing basis. Utilize access control and authentication. Implement strict access control and robust authentication, such as MFA and also biometric. Certain critical areas should require both. Ensure that an authorized personnel only can access critical systems. And also, I'm not a big fan of taking a laptop off of the IT environment and bringing it into the OT or ICS environment. Dedicated systems only, and the access policy should be correlated to those devices and correlated to the segment design itself. You want to establish as much containment as possible for the system by segment design. Any additional containment within the segment can be addressed by access control lists and policies. Device inventory should be strongly correlated to access control. As a matter of fact, ideally, it should be an exact match. Anything that's not correlated should be immediately addressed. You do an inventory on it, and then you do a risk assessment on it, and then you add it to the access control mechanism. Utilize access control to build and maintain the asset inventory on an ongoing basis. And finally, establish policies to deal with rogue or misbehaving devices. Very seldom can you take a device out of an industrial control system or operational technology environment. So make sure that if you're going to isolate a system or a device, it's not going to take down the whole process. Network segmentation is very important. This prevents malicious actors or malicious malware from moving laterally across your network. Critical systems should be isolated from less sensitive ones, and firewalls should be employed to regulate and inspect traffic between the zones. This way, if we get a compromise in one segment, the rest of the network can maintain and be secured. Now, design the segments in according to the requirements of the system's data footprint. Do you need multiple subnets? Do you need IP multicast? Do you need a single layer 2 domain, i.e. a single subnet, or are we dealing with non-IP protocols such as SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition type protocols? Do I need a private VLAN environment where the spokes cannot communicate with one another, but everyone can communicate up to the hub or the head end? It's very common in industrial control or operational technologies environments where you don't want the devices communicating directly with one another. Dedicated segmentation provides for a normalized traffic environment. This is important. Remember, when we did our asset inventory, we looked at the communication footprint. We now have a normalized idea. The segment should have that normalized pattern. This provides easier anomaly detection. Very important value benefit of segmentation that many folks don't consider. Now, in my mind, segments should be isolated. Unless you can come up and give me strong reasons for attachment to the rest of the network, you should have an isolation. If you do need to do it via security demarcation, like in the Purdue reference model, implement a data diode policy where only one-way traffic or very limited bidirectional traffic happens between specific systems. So you want to be very, very specific in the policies that you allow. Employ penetration testing on a regular basis to validate your system protection and your segment design. Patch management, vulnerability assessment, this should be done regularly, but also keep in mind that this should be done on an interrupt basis as well to implement security vulnerability patches. We should regularly update software and firmware in the environment, and we should also conduct vulnerability assessments against those releases to identify and fix weaknesses. Test your updates thoroughly to avoid disrupting operations. It's always wise to do that ahead of time. I want to talk about the CrowdStrike event, where people were just taking automatic updates of CrowdStrike and actually taking down their systems. It was probably one of the biggest internet outages, and nobody tested the code. Those that did test did not deploy. So automatic updates can be a bite. I really strongly advise against automatic updates in OT and ICS environments. You really should test them thoroughly in a testbed environment prior to putting it out into your production. Also, understand the vendor's cadence and software support programs. Also, understand the technical support programs and also the access requirements that those technical support staff will have or require for your environment. Understand the vendor's own processes and vulnerability assessment and secure code development. If a device has an uncertain origin, or if the vendors in question cannot really answer the above points, then you really need to consider whether that device should be in your network at all. Implement security vulnerability patches as soon as possible. And again, that is interrupt driven. You have to do that based on CVSS. Remote access security. This touches on the aspects of support, but also for your own staff, because many OT environments are dispersed across a wide geography. Think traffic management systems and things of that nature. So remote access comes sort of part and parcel. However, we want to minimize the risk of unauthorized access during remote maintenance. So we want to use dedicated PCs that are up to date, recently scanned for vulnerabilities. We want to log and record every access session, and we want to optimally we want to utilize deep packet inspection for post-session analysis, particularly if there's an incident so that we can do forensics after the fact. We also want to understand the vendor's support requirements and how it relates to remote access. How often do they need access? What are the grounds? What are the policies you're going to establish? And then you match a corresponding and create a corresponding policy environment to meet those requirements. Implement specialized gateways for this. Do not use your general purpose employee remote access. Create a specialized remote access mechanism for your OT and your ICS environments. Intrusion detection and prevention and analytics. You want to employ IDPS to monitor traffic in real time. The reason why is you want to see these anomalies at the outset. The sooner you notice the anomaly, the sooner you'll be able to get actions in order to mitigate whatever's going on. Be sure to review and fine-tune configuration of the detection systems to make sure they're up to date. Make sure your threat protection feeds are valid and up to date as well, because that will protect you against evolving attacks. Be sure to protect the wireless environment as well with a dedicated WIPS. A great example is Extreme Networks Air Defense. Utilize port level analytics. Again, Extreme Networks provide very detailed port analytics to monitor normalized traffic patterns. Again, look for changes or anomalies, and you can only do that if you have an established normalized baseline. Very important. Utilize RSPAN or technologies like ISID mirroring to direct traffic to dedicated capture points for DPI analysis and forensics after fact. Security information and event management. Realize that logs aren't just laying in repositories. You need to look at them. You need to analyze them. First step, be sure to provide a synchronized timestamp for the environment as a whole. Every device should be synchronized to the same timestamp. Otherwise, your logs are going to be nonsensical. Be certain every device and system is covered. Consider the rollover capacity of the device as well. Some devices need to be updated more often than others and queried more often than others. Fine-tune alerts and adjust over time. Baseline normal activity within the system. So we're not only talking about traffic and activity on the network, but also from a log and event activity as well. Flag and investigate any unusual activities within the system or within the devices. Map and classify assets to inventory. That speaks for itself. You should have already accomplished that. And then obviously update it as necessary and implement customized alerts for your environment if you find it necessary. Employee training and awareness is also a very important aspect to all of this because the human being is often the weakest link. Regularly train employees on your best practices. Conduct simulated phishing exercises to enhance security awareness and reduce human error. Track employee education. Make sure they take it. It will be nice to quiz them too. Make sure they really absorb what they're being educated on. Again, track your simulated phishing exercises. Educate repeat offenders, those that click on things. Make sure they're aware of what they missed and why. Foster a proactive approach to security in both IT and OT environments. Everybody, every user contributes. Make them aware that they are a very active portion in the security posture of your organization. Provide education and guidance to code development staff to ensure proper secure coding practices, and then, of course, review those practices as well and any product that's generated to make sure that it's complied to. Very important piece if you're manufacturing devices and shipping out code embedded on those devices. Incident response and business continuity planning. This is important. No one wants to get to this point, but do not ignore it. It's very important because it is your last resort. Develop and regularly update your incident response plan. Outline the roles, responsibilities, and then more importantly, or just as importantly, outline your technologies and have that in prep. Ensure a business continuity plan is in place to maintain operations, not only during a cybersecurity attack, but also during a physical event. Think about hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, things of that nature. A lot can happen outside of cybersecurity that can take your services and your network down. Be sure to provide for adequate protection in the event of ransomware. And really, there's only one real guarantee there in your last order and that is secure offline backups. And then also validate and test the backups as well. Don't wait and then find out that you have torn backups and that they aren't good for anything. That doesn't give you any value. It's just a false sense of security. So you want to make sure that you validate and test the backups that you're generating because that is your best guarantee against a ransomware event. Rehearse the incident response plan on a regular basis and establish a team to release public announcements when required. And really on that team, you should have PR people, you should have legal, you should have a number of upper level staff, perhaps CXO type level people involved in this team, because at some point, God forbid, but at some point you may have to make a public statement and you want to make that as quickly and as coherently as possible. It'll make a big difference on the public impression. Compliance and standards. This is very important. You need to adhere to the industry's specific regulations and cybersecurity standards. But remember, compliance does not equal security and vice versa. It does, however, provide guidelines that are specific to your industry and your organization. It also demonstrates a commitment to safeguarding critical infrastructure. You want to implement governance and oversight to ensure the compliance that you've mandated. You also want to ensure both IT and OT and ICS environments comply to it. Participate in industry consortiums whenever you can, and also participate in standard activities. Find out what peers in your industry are doing. You may find a lot of advice in that arena. Now, to close, Extreme Networks provides a wide variety of technologies to provide for a secure networking environment. In the areas of segmentation, we provide our network fabric technology, our enterprise fabric, an Ethernet non-IP based fabric technology that generates what's called stealth networking. Because it doesn't use IP, it becomes very dark and hard to enumerate from an attacker's perspective. It also has the capacity for hyper segmentation, which is very high density dynamic segmentation that's driven by a policy substrate. And that's a northbound engine called Universal Zero Trust Network Access, where we have zero trust network application capabilities, plus a network application control environment for IoT, OT devices, and ICS devices as well, if so desired. Now, this is an important piece because, as I said earlier, you want to match your segment design to the system footprint. Now, what happens is you match Universal ZTNA with policies that match the segment design. Now you're assured that appropriate staff with appropriate hardware are accessing appropriate systems in their appropriate segments, and you have a good granular degree of control over who can touch what. And then you have a very good logging capability to know who accesses the networks and when. Very important piece. And then finally, when we move over to the far left-hand side, we see air interface protection with Air Defense Essentials, again, providing that intrusion protection environment and intrusion detection environment within the wireless domain of interest, which is increasingly being prevalent in the edge, not only within the IT environments, but within the OT and ICS environments as well. So we don't answer all the pieces to the puzzle. We can't address all areas of practice. However, we can bring a good amount to the table from our technology portfolio to complement your security operations for your OT and ICS and IoT technologies. So this is obviously a very broad subject, and I don't want to go any further into this because really at that point you're into some very, very granular details. So in lieu of that, what I've done is I've given you additional references and sources that you can use. Please feel free to access all of them. They are all open, they are all free, and they are all yours. I do want to highlight MITRE ATT&CK for industrial control systems. That's a new advent that I've seen. Really cool. Again, this is pretty nascent, so we'll see it evolve over time. MITRE ATT&CK also has a matrix that they've created for machine learning and artificial intelligence as well. I will introduce you to that on our next session, as well as additional resources in that regard as well. So this closes down on the subject of OT, ICS, and IoT and how to secure those systems. The next time you hear from me, it's going to be how do I secure artificial intelligence and machine learning environments that are more and more commonly being used as backends to these technologies. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this very informative, and I want to ask you one question before we close. Are you extreme? Thank you very much. I'm Ed Kohler, signing off until next time.